Okay, good morning and welcome to this session. My name is Vera Trapman and I'm a professor of comparative employment relations, and I'm really excited to have this chance that we can have an input here on the Labora 24 to fill a gap on the international perspective of just transition. I'm co-lead of the Hans Böckler funded project on just transition in a global perspective. And we look at the understanding of just transition among labor and trade unions in 13 countries. We analyze how labor shapes climate policies and what initiatives and practical transformations allow a social, fair and just implementation of ecological transformation. The 13 countries you can see here, we look at North America, we look at South America, we look at Africa. Clicker is not working. We have more slides, so we need the clicker to get working.
Yes, perfect.
Okay, so there you see the countries that we look at in this study. We look at North and South America, we look at Africa, we look at Asia, and we look at Europe. And for today, we have selected 5 countries that we like to showcase to you: Germany, Russia, United States, South Africa, and Spain. We will go ahead and have 5 presentations. Each colleague has like 5 minutes. I'm here with my colleague Felix, and we have 4 more colleagues online joining us from around the world. And then we have 20 minutes for discussion, so just so you know what to expect. So now I hand over to Felix for the case of Germany.
So when we look at Germany, we have to understand the just transition in the context of wider transformations. While the term just transition is used a lot in political debates, when it comes to the concrete actions within unions, transformation is the big topic. Often with a prefix social ecological, but also from the IG Metall we know Verwandel. And that not only includes climate change, which is one pillar, but it always, as we've heard this morning as well, has to be understood in the context of digitalization and demographic change as the 3 big pillars of transformation that we're witnessing. Since we're interested in this climate change aspect, and the just transition usually refers to this in political debates, in Germany, unions agree that, as we've heard as well this morning, Germany should not be industrialized. We should remain an industrial country, but we should do so as a climate leader. And one important factor then is not only how can we decarbonize firms and stay on top in the world, but also how can we make it happen that employees and workers transition into these decarbonized economies. So this is what they all agree upon. But as always, there are different unions, different players, there are always some contentious part. And one is when we look at the scale of this just transition. And while everybody agrees that climate change is a global issue, when it comes to the concrete actions of unions, this happens mostly on the national and regional level, which makes sense because this is their sphere of influence. At the same time, there are some conflicts when it comes to what is just on a global level. Is it just what we're seeing now, if Germany takes an action and we lose out and labor goes elsewhere, or should we see this big just climate change in a more historical context? There, union leaders sometimes disagree. Then it comes to the depth of this transition. For most of them, it is a critique of a very neoliberal, market-driven economic doctrine that we are having. And the solution is to have the state in a driver's seat, to cooperate with unions, to have investments, which we also heard this morning. This is one of the large demands. And then we can actually tackle climate change. However, there's this minority position that we're seeing when we talk to different union people, that maybe these problems are more deeply rooted. Maybe it's not just neoliberalism, but maybe it's some aspects of capitalism in general, through these exploitative aspects that exploits labor as well as nature in the global south. However, this is really at the fringes in the labor movement in Germany. And lastly, what we've heard as well this morning already, speed. How fast should this transformation be? They all agree on some general overall targets. Germany should remain industrial but carbon neutral. But how fast should this go? And what we see in interviews, in some position papers, there are some differences between industrial unions as well as the service unions, which also has to do, as we've heard today, because sometimes it's easier to forge alliances, for instance, for the service unions. When it comes to the allies, we've also talked about this morning, so it's a bit of a recap and going a bit more into depth. For a labor union, the natural allies are other unions. They organize as part of the DGB, but also they seek strategic alliances among the industrial unions. But there's also, as we've heard, between the IGBCE and the VCI, they forge alliances, they have projects together, and these are all usually very selective and targeted. When can we forge alliances to be more powerful in our demands? And the third one are environmental NGOs. Over the years, we see there is this growing formation of alliances, not only between service unions and environmental NGOs, but more and more also with industrial unions. And lastly, because the sphere of influence is very much Germany on the national and regional level, when it comes to European or international politics, unions in Germany engaged with these supranational union bodies, such as the ITUC, ETUC, industry, all to really have their demands heard. So then the last point is, what can we give? What kind of examples and initiatives are there in Germany? Which can be three different parts. Unions see themselves as mediators in this transformation. They really stand between environmental movements and sometimes the industry. We've seen this in the coal phase out and the negotiations. We see this with their members in different educational programs to get the topic closer to them. Then there's a social dimension, which a lot is about training rights and moving workers. And here we have the Transformationskurzarbeitergeld, which in a way is trying to be implemented as these Qualifizierungsgeld as well, what we're seeing. And lastly, unions see it as an opportunity to strengthen good work. For instance, by demanding that requirements of collective bargaining and other forms of good work are implemented in public tenders. And lastly, we see this in a project which is called Revierwende, which is really about how can we foster and engage in the structural changes in the coal regions by, for instance, strengthening good work.
Thanks, Felix, for this analysis on Germany. We also included two geopolitical powers, as we think it's important to understand their actions in this area. And we start with Russia by my dear colleague Olga, please.
Hello, everyone. I'm Olga, Senior Research Associate of University of Johannesburg, and I work on a Russian case. So I should say that up to this year, just transition didn't appear anywhere in stakeholders' discourse and newspapers or anywhere. In 2024, new government started to talk about just transition from the perspective of independent choice of the countries, how to perform just transition, in what way, what pace, what technologies, and the government, Russian government, stresses that energy transition, just energy transition, should be done at the expense of socioeconomic development. If we look at the reality of Russia, we can see that coal mining is expanding, and energy policy is very powerful. Climate policy is mostly focused on the consumption of CO2, but Russian government does recognize the risks of world decarbonization trends and try to protect mining regions through diversification of economy of these regions. But as such, just transition policies, measures, programs, they do not exist in Russia. When I talk to different stakeholders, I notice that they have almost the same perception of justice in these transition processes. Justice means jobs, wages, and prosperity in countries. If talk about coal unions, representatives, they mostly focused on supporting social contract between employers and employees. And they admitted that we are trade unions, we totally should be out of political agenda. That's why just transition questions or climate policy questions are not existing in their discourse. As for coal miners, for them, wages and jobs, it's a way to escape to escape from mining regions to provide better future for the children. The reason is very heavy environmental situation in these regions. Indeed, the goal of the government is to keep coal rent, to protect the industry from decarbonization trends of the world, and the price that should be paid for it is actually environment. It's fall on the workers, their families, and local communities who live in this region. Yeah. So, can you please change? Yeah. So, environmental issues quite urgent in mining regions, and environmental NGOs used to be the main voices against this very heavily situation, but nowadays they are almost all prohibited in Russia. But there are local activists, local communities who raises the question, what should we do with the environment? But what is interesting here, they do not protest against coal as such. They demand just proper way of mining. This I found very interesting nuance in Russian environment. So, and one small example of negative example of program addressing just transition in Russia is the program Clean Coal, Clean Kuzbas. Kuzbas is a title of coal mining region. It was launched in 2022. The main goal of this program actually is to create new jobs in non-mining spheres to diversify economy. Of course, the program included environment safety solutions creation, clean coal mining solutions, but it doesn't work. It still continues now, but it doesn't work. First of all, because there are no any mandatory requirements to implement these solutions. And environmental standards are actually getting easier and easier for companies. And the second reason is that workers themselves, they are not ready to accept this program. Youngsters, they are leaving the region, they look for better life. And old workers, they are not ready to change the profession, to go into other education, so they prefer to stay where they are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olga. And now we hand over to the US and to my colleague Hunter. Can we get the screen with the... Just that Hunter can introduce himself, that we just see the person who speaks about the case. Can we switch this once to the screen with the speakers, please?
Technical failure now here, yes.
We tried that yesterday and it worked fluently and perfectly.
If not, then Hunter, you just introduce yourself. We won't see you, but we have your wonderful voice in the background.
Okay, my name is Hunter Moskowitz. I am a PhD candidate at Northeastern University in Boston. Oh, there we go. And a research specialist at the University of California, Santa Cruz, working with Dr. Meejin Shah and Dr. Larry Skinner on this project. So today, I'm going to talk about the Just Transition case study in the United States. And what we have is sort of two, in the past, I'd say we've had two major definitions of a just transition. The first one being a more narrow definition, which comes from fossil fuel unions, and that is a super fund for workers. That's basically a funding source for workers in the fossil fuel industry to continue on in their livelihoods if something like a coal plant shuts down. And so that includes things like protections for communities and fossil workers in terms of wage replacement, retirement and pension plans that are fully funded, healthcare and retraining for workers, all of which is part of sort of packages that could be offered. And for communities, we can think about this in terms of economic diversification if a community is dependent on a certain fossil fuel industry. Now, in terms of And that's really focused on unions with members who work in energy and around the fossil fuel industry. For service and public sector unions, things like teachers unions, environmentalist groups, the definition has really expanded outward to a social and economic transformation that especially has happened with the idea of a Green New Deal in the United States, which would expand the powers of the federal government and industrial expansion, a massive industrial expansion that could meet the creation of a renewable energy economy. What we've seen in our research, however, that between groups of unions, there has coalesced sort of a new definition of simply the creation of renewable energy jobs, the making of a clean energy economy in addition sort of to the fossil fuel economy as the definition of a just transition, seen through the passage in 2022 of the US's first major legislation when it comes to climate, which is the Inflation Reduction Act, which is legislation that creates market and government incentives for renewable energy projects, along with tax incentives to have labor standards. So one trade union leader that was interviewed said that what they envisioned was a unified campaign-focused effort to ensure that a new clean energy infrastructure is built, and it's built with strong labor and equity standards that give union contractors a fair chance at winning the work. So again, that focus on union contractors is really thinking about that from the perspective of the market and making new renewable energy jobs. Contentions, of course, remain between sort of traditionally these service and public sector unions focused on the social and economic transformation and the transportation, energy, and construction unions who have workers in the fossil fuel sectors who think more in this narrow definition. So it's really a struggle over decarbonization, thinking about how fossil fuel unions have fought against the idea of a just transition that eliminates any type of fossil fuel jobs. Saw that with the Dakota Access Pipeline, which is a natural gas pipeline in the Midwest that was constructed on behalf, partly from lobbying from construction unions and fossil fuel unions against environmentalists, indigenous rights group, because this was built through the Standing Rock Reservation in North Dakota, and other unions like public sector and labor unions who sort of fought against this. And so that sort of epitomizes this divide. There are other issues of contention, such as the scope of a just transition. We look at which types of workers should be included in just transition efforts. Should it only be fossil fuel workers, or does this include unions who represent farm workers, whose workers work out in the sun and are affected by the changes of climate change? Similarly, there's a big focus in the United States on environmental justice communities. Those are communities of color in the United States who have borne the brunt of climate change and the effects of pollution. And the question remains of whether those communities will be included in this new renewable energy economy, or traditionally sort of kept out as they have been, and from participation in unions. So looking at two examples of a just transition, thinking more in that vein of the renewable energy job creation definition, we have the Climate Jobs Natural Resource Center, which is a nonprofit that has built coalitions at the state level to pass labor standards in the renewable energy and sort of industry, and sort of bridges that divide between the fossil fuel unions and the public sector and service unions. And it's really thinking about taking a more proactive stance of labor on climate change versus sort of reacting to what environmentalists have put forward. Looking at that more narrow definition, we have an Office of Just Transition in the state of Colorado, which is a program for coal transition communities and workers looking for specific funding sources. It's really looking to find those types of grants and funding that could sort of transition workers' livelihoods. And this plan that it put forward, its action plan, was influenced by the work of labor unions who are part of committees to look into funding sources. So while both of those examples show different definitions, what we're not seeing here is a sort of plan for decarbonization or that kind of social and economic transformation, which is still an ongoing issue within the labor movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Hunter. Yeah, from one of the biggest economies of the world to the biggest economy to Africa, South Africa, and I hand over to my colleagues. Alex, please.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name's Alex Beresford, Associate Professor in African Politics at the University of Leeds, and I'm leading the South African case study for this project. And it's a really important case study because it looks at the kind of politicization of just transition in particular. Now, the debates around just transition in South Africa, like elsewhere in the world, were initiated by the trade union movement themselves over 2 decades ago. But from the outset, South Africa's unions have been wary about what they see as the danger for a capitalist co-optation of the just transition concept. And they were very ambivalent from the outset about a fossil fuel transition in particular because of the dependence on fossil fuel jobs in South Africa. Nonetheless, COSATU, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, has set forward a bold and very expansive eco-socialist blueprint for a just transition and has really galvanized the conversation amongst activists, NGOs, and also the government. The government then is quite a late responder to these debates, and it initiated its Just Transition Framework in 2022, which brought together unions and NGOs and activists, and there was a broad consensus around its plan. But nonetheless, this was consensus in ambiguity because there wasn't really much clarity about what the plan would look like in practice in South Africa. We began to see much more clarity about what this might look like once you got the international dimension and questions about whose transition this was after all. In particular, at COP26 and COP27, South Africa struck some really significant agreements with Western donor states who were offering to finance South Africa's transition, particularly with a focus on the high-polluting energy sector. However, at this particular moment, we begin to see a change in the language away from justice and more towards conservative ideals around resilience. So in terms of what's contentious about the just transition, unions in particular see this increasingly as a neoliberal foreign imposed transition upon them. They're concerned about the finance coming from Western donor states and the indebtedness of the South African state. They're concerned about procedural injustice around this. So unionists talking about how they had no influence over the COP26 and 27 agreements. They're concerned that they're being pushed into accelerating a transition when the country is just not ready for it in terms of the job market and social protections. They're also concerned at what they see as very much a neoliberal assault on workers' interests, particularly what they call a charter for privatization, particularly in the energy sector, as part of this transition being pushed from outside. They also point to international double standards as they see it with regard to demand in Europe for South Africa's coal at a time where European states are effectively trying to finance South Africa's own transition away from coal. So this has generated a real complex kind of political situation. There are those who are for the Just Energy Transition Partnership, notably the government, the Western financiers, the IMF and the World Bank, private capital behind the renewable projects, and some of the NGO activists. Those against it, though, now increasingly are the trade unions, although to varying degrees, the fossil fuel businesses and political elites aligned to them. There are some environmental activists who are quite sympathetic towards this position, but there's also an emerging populist party called Umkhonto we Sizwe that did very well in the recent elections. What's important, though, is that these groups are united in their indignation against what they see as a form of green colonialism and foreign imposed adjustment, rather than having a clear, coherent agenda for what might be. So in terms of a positive example out of all this, well, it depends on who you speak to. According to the proponents of the Just Energy Transition Partnership, it represents a groundbreaking partnership and indeed a blueprint for other states in the global south to follow. There have been some recorded successes on the ground in terms of consumers and individual businesses going off-grid, so taking themselves away from the national energy grid and just installing solar panels themselves on the roofs of their houses or in the backyards of their businesses. However, I think it's important to note that one particular example of what's seen as the failure of just transition has become very highly politicized, and that is the closure of the Komati power station in Mpumalanga. This is seen as being symbolic of what might follow in future for the communities and workers most impacted in the fossil fuel sector, particularly around coal energy. We've already seen dramatic job losses in the town, but also a wider ripple effect on the local economy in terms of businesses that are dependent upon the trade from the power stations, and indeed the infrastructural funding for schools that comes from the corporate social responsibility agreements with the power stations. There's concern that this is now creating a ghost town dynamic around Komati that might have a ripple effect to the wider region. And this is all fueling then this wider politicization of the just transition, and unions are beginning to dig their heels in to try and resist, and if need be, they say, sabotage the just transition that's being imposed upon them as they see it from outside. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Alex, for these interesting insights. We come back to Europe now, to the case of Spain, presented by my colleague, Joe.
Hi, everyone, and thanks, Vera. My name is Jo Cutter. I'm a lecturer in work and employment relations at the University of Leeds. I'm a colleague of Vera, Felix, and Alex, working on the UK and the Spanish case studies. I'm just going to introduce Spain today. So in terms of the meaning of just transition in Spain, it reflects the two possible models, I think, that Hunter set out in the US case, that the Spanish is essentially a broad consensus on the phasing out of fossil fuels. So in that sense, it's fairly narrow in its scope, although I would say it's a very deep approach, and I'll come on to some of the ways in which that's been supported, that phase out has been supported. In one way, essentially, just transition, or the transición justa, has been embedded into law, and there's been a strong focus on action in terms of supporting fossil fuel workers and their local communities around the key sites that are being closed. In the interest of time, I won't go through that detailed quote, but essentially it's a sort of supported from the Spanish Trade Union Federation negotiator that yes, just transition is a positive thing, but we need to support people and territories and ensure that they have the same conditions in terms of in a sense, the new situation as those sites and plants and communities transition. Next slide, please. So as I've mentioned, the interesting thing about just transition in Spain is that it's within law. So it's an integrated climate, energy transition and just transition law that led to the development of a requirement of urgent action plans. And these are over 5 years. So in Spain, they're just coming towards the end of the first 5-year phase, focused on, firstly, this tripart agreements between unions, government and energy businesses at a sectoral level around the phase out of coal and the closure of thermal power plants. The interesting development is also the territorial agreements, which I'll come on to in a moment, that these multi-actor agreements in the localities affected, supported with a set of coordination protocols that are, there's one more point, thank you, Felix. There's a national coordination unit, the Just Transition Institute. The institute itself has strong trade union input, but also, essentially it's an independent body, but located within government department for transition in terms of coordinating the agreements and facilitating the local design of the territorial agreements. Next slide, please. So here's the map. So here are the 15 locations across the country. Most of them are in the north, but they are spread actually around of different aspects, north, south, and in the Balearic Islands. And in terms of those agreements, as I've highlighted, they were facilitated by the Just Transition Institute, but very much involved events, dialogues, consultations with the local authorities. I mean, there may be a number of local municipal authorities affected in those geographical areas that have been prescribed, in terms of the local trade unions involved, environmental groups, and obviously the businesses, both in terms of businesses where the closures were happening, some of those where they're coal thermal power plants, is about the transition of those plants into alternative forms of power, but also focusing investment in those areas is very much in terms of inward investment for new green transition, new energy projects, as well as the decommissioning of those sites, so often environmental restoration around, say, huge open cast coal mines that have been restored. So far, they've had relative success in job creation. in terms of those job lost. So there's just over 5,000 workers and contractors. It was an interesting inclusion in those agreements that it should be also contractors that would be affected by those closures. In addition, there have been early retirement of around 300 affected. And interestingly, they also brought into the agreements 2 nuclear power plants that had already been closed down, but the regions in which they were located had not been subject to any support for transition. So that's an additional 500 workers supported in those plants. So as I've highlighted, jobs tend to be in relation to decommissioning, environmental regeneration, but also these new green energy sector investments, which often at the moment are in the stage of proposals because some of the thermal power plants won't be closed until in the next 2 or 3 years. So one of the interesting elements is the ongoing scrutiny by unions and others over questions of the actual outcomes on the ground, clearly questions of job quality, the opportunities for training, they are in place, but clearly people are interested in those outcomes. So one of the interesting developments, and I think would be of interest perhaps in other countries to learn the lesson, is the recent development of new local observatories to really have an understanding of what is happening and how workers and their communities are facing the transition. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you, Joe, for giving us some kind of ideas how it can work on the ground from the case of Spain. The floor is open now for discussion. Please, if you have any questions, comments.
Everybody's stunned.
Here's a question, yeah?
There's a microphone
There's a
coming
micro,
for you.
yeah.
Well, thanks. Good morning, Hans Kühn from IGBC in Germany, international officer. This is why I'm very glad to follow the discussions today, as we are focusing on the just transition topics all over Europe and also all the world. So pretty interesting. What I have a question to all the panelists or the participants, how to bring together all the findings that you had here with our work on the ground. So we as a unions, we're focusing now all over the world to support just transition, also to support other unions from German perspective. But I don't really know how to bring the results together now, because we really want to support it. And I think your findings could also be a support for our work.
Thank you.
Yeah. I take that question. That demand. That's exactly what we want to do. So at the moment, this is what we presented, the kind of national overview, what's going on in the countries, and at the moment we are digging more deeply into particular just transition initiatives, and we want to create some kind of repository of cases where, and we are probably hosting it with the European Trade Union Institute, so that it's accessible for trade unions and they could look, okay, what happens in the transport sector in particular countries, what are regional initiatives. And we are really interested in dialogue with the trade unions and others for whom this is important. There will be a conference next year in Brussels, but we are also really happy to hold smaller discussions with trade unions to see what this international dimension actually means.
Hi, thanks a lot for the nice inputs. My name is Michael. I'm working for the Next Economy Lab in Bonn, and I was wondering, like, you've all now presented very different discourses on how just transition is being viewed in all the different countries, and I'm wondering, like, how do you see that as a huge impediment, maybe also to forging alliances, to maybe work together better when it comes to topics like supply chains or whatever else that affect different countries and different unions that are all positioned along this supply chain? Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thanks for that question as well. So having an overview of all the case studies, I think what is really important, what came through our research, is that maybe just transition doesn't work as a term for this political agenda that we have. So if it's, first of all, if it might become almost an empty signifier. So everybody puts in what they think a just transition should be. But if the differences are so huge from like kind of protecting jobs of workers in the fossil fuel to this is a neo-colonial project in South Africa. So maybe that is not something that will help building worker solidarity around creating a just and ecological sustainable future. So I think we have heard this morning we need to think about how we talk about transformation, and we would need to add, we need to think what kind of language can we actually use. It's not only about the narration, but also how do we use concepts to think about the future.
I think it's about being more concrete. So when we ask unionists in Germany, this just transition term is great if you need money from the European Union, you have some public tenders, great, let's put the word in there, they need to hear it. But on the ground, we really need to be concrete. Which sector are we looking at? What are the differences here? What does it mean in concrete terms? And I think here, we had this overview in general of each country, which we're having reports as well that can be shared with the labor unions. But we're going to have these particular sectors as well, because we have to look at each sector as well separately, because each sector is has its idiosyncrasies that needs to be included. And by digging deeper into this, I think that we can highlight again what are the similarities and differences across all these countries. If you take coal, not only in Germany we have dealt with it, but also in South Africa and China, for instance, what are the commonalities, what are the differences, and what can we learn from it? And at the same time, how can we potentially foster collaborations between German trade unions and, for instance, South African trade unions, where there were some developments, I think, as well. Alex said there was a lot of interest from the South African side as well, correct?
Yeah, I think that's an important point. And I don't want to leave everyone with a depressing picture of South Africa, because there's real hope within all this as well, I think, because, the South African unions are not climate denialists. Like, they are looking to resist what they see as the transition as they're faced with it at the moment, but they want to build international alliances to kind of craft a more just transition moving forward and to learn from international experiences. And that requires some very difficult conversations, I think, in particular with unions, for example, in Germany, because if South Africa is going to transition in the energy sector, it needs to start manufacturing solar panels in South Africa itself. And that's a question of intellectual property rights. And those are the kinds of alliances that I think would be useful with German trade unions, for example, to try and build shared campaigns around the sharing of renewable intellectual property and those kinds of issues in campaigns to really galvanize collective action.
Yeah, and there's the South African trade unions have said they would actually like to co-produce some training materials for the South African trade union movement. And that would be, so within the project we have now discussed that it would be good if we could actually help providing some kind of this training materials. And that would be good to co-produce with the unions in Germany as well. So it would be really good to have a discussion about this.
Yeah, thank you for the support, because I think we are at a crucial point. We have already had some chats with National Union of Mine Workers last year over there in Cape Town, where they exactly did the mirror that you gave us today. What are you looking for? Situation is completely different. We have good collective agreement. Guys, this is neo-colonialism. And this is why I really hope that we also, with this project together, can bring some support in. I know that Friedrich Ebert Foundation is also supporting the whole topic and their JETP work over there. We are really willing to do so. So let's please keep in touch. Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay, super.
Meldet sich jemand?
Any questions on the chat or in the room? Otherwise, I would like, Stefan.
I have just a question. How do trade unions all around the world, in the countries you have researched, deal with the time question? Because as far as I understand it, 40 years ago, it would be very comfortable to make a transition to a just and ecological economy, but now we are running out of time.
I mean, maybe Dennis, you want to say something about this. From my reading, from my reading, there is no urgency in it's about finding the right way, and maybe at the expense of the time pressure and the urgency. So that's from an environmental perspective, that is quite a big dilemma.
I think Joe had her hand up as well. Maybe Joe and Dennis can.
Dennis, go ahead. You had your hand up, I think.
I'm sorry. I was just looking at my own questions that I have on the screen, and therefore missed what the actual question was. I'm very sorry about that.
But I guess, again, I mean, they see themselves as mediators unions, right? Particularly in Germany. And if we do it too fast, that's the conversation that at least that I'm having with them, that this big project will fail. Because if you don't get enough public acceptance, and for them acceptance also comes from the workers. I mean, if we look at some other survey data, even labor unions have some issues with the rise of the far right. So unfortunately, if we don't do it right, and if we don't integrate them and have their voices heard on the one hand, which is more democratic aspects, and on the other hand, the economic aspects, if we don't economically let them be part of this transformation, I think then it will fail. So for them, the focus is we can have the greatest targets, 2045, 2040, we can all have a competition. And the UK was one like, oh, we are the fastest now. But all the targets in the world don't help us if we don't actually implement the policies. And I think this is, at least what I heard, is this is what we need to focus on, the how, because on the if we have agreed.
Thanks, I'm Fabian. I work for Friedrich Ebert Foundation and trade union work in Latin America. And I have actually a question for the colleague on the Russian case study, because what we found in the work with Latin America is something similar what was mentioned here in the South African case, of sort of a neo-colonialism, it being like a very Western project. We should provide the lithium for the German-European transition, but then again, we also remain an extractivist economic model, and no one cares about our transition. I was wondering in the Russian discourse, how far is just transition also connotated as a Western concept and therefore delegitimized, or it hinders any sort of environmental initiative?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I should say that before this year, any initiatives concerning decarbonization, climate change initiatives try to be delegitimized by the government, talking that this is a hostile initiative of the West to readjust markets, technological markets or fossil markets. But starting from this year, all these conversations stopped, or they became very, very down low. And now they talk about just fair and just transition for all, meaning the whole world. Like Russia in discourse tries to be this fair partner in just transition for these former colonial countries to protect their interests and so on and so on. So it's very interesting change of this year in political discourse. I hope I answered your question.
Okay, thank you very much for coming, and maybe you can share another slide, the QR code. We have actually a series of podcasts if you want to know more about individual countries that we didn't present today, and soon there will be the reports published as well as some policy briefs. So we try to condense everything what we think is the most relevant for the policy world as well. Thank you.
Thank you.